Um, just a couple of short administrative announcements. One, so yesterday we identified as a good time for a review slash Q&A slash discussion of the midterm responses, May 12th at 4:30 p.m. So I have that on my calendar now. I will put it on the website soon. I apologize, I didn't get a chance to do that last night. I basically fell asleep on the couch. And in addition to that, I just wanted to let everyone know I am, extremely happy to meet individually or with groups. I've met with a couple of study groups to sort of talk through individual, outline issues or, talk about past exams. I'm happy to do that with other groups or with anyone individually. I am, in the next couple of weeks, I am largely free and I plan on being around here. And so I will have a lot of time available. And so I'm happy to make appointments to meet with anyone. I tend to be a night owl, so I don't like morning meetings. But on the other hand, the other side of that coin is I have met with, folks as late as midnight before, and I'm totally happy to do that because that sort of fits my body clock. If it doesn't fit yours, if you're a morning person, I apologize. And also I'm jealous. The midterms will be back early next week, I think. I'm not sure. I'm going to talk to the registrar later today about the process of returning them, because I will have the PDF files that everyone submitted marked up. And so I think they're going to email them to everyone, although that's a lot of emails. So I don't know if there's another more efficient way or not. But look for that next week. Also, just as a reminder, I'm looking for a TA for next year. If you're interested, email me a resume, email me a couple of paragraphs describing what you see the role as and why you'd be interested or why you'd be a good fit. Don't need grades or anything like that, because that's not something I'm really looking for. I'm looking for more, interest and enthusiasm and willingness to get up and teach and talk to students outside of class and things like that. Any questions on any of those mechanics before we dive in? Okay, so quick recap of what we talked about last time before we turn back to zoning and then takings. So we began last time by wrapping up the Euclid case, Village of Euclid versus Ambler Realty, where we noted a bit of a recurring criticism of these cases, which is that the court has apparently in mind this distinctly upper class or upper middle class suburban vision of a good life. And so, for instance, it seems very skeptical of the role of apartments in a city, even though its legal justification is that zoning is justified by the historical practice of regulating nuisances, but it's very hard to say that apartments would ever be a nuisance in a legal sense. A lot of zoning ordinances today seem to share the assumptions and the worldview of this case, and that has consequences. So as we'll see today, it might mean that communities can try to regulate aesthetics or drive out poor people or expressly try to legislate conformity. And that might give us pause about the effects of zoning. And so as one example of that, we turn to PA Northwestern, which is about a city's ability to zone out an existing use, to take something that is a lawful pre-existing use of land and say, no, that no longer conforms to the zoning rules. But it's also about the fact that in that case, the town, was trying to get rid of an adult bookstore. And so there, the 4 days after the bookstore opened, the town, gave notice that it was going to amend its zoning rules to basically make this use illegal. Not everywhere, but a lot of places, and not clear if they had moved somewhere else, whether they would, be rezoned out of business again. And so the Pennsylvania Supreme Court says that's not allowed, that if this town wants to deny PA Northwestern its lawful pre-existing use, then that's a taking and they have to pay monetary compensation. So a few notes on that. One, be super careful about this. This is the Pennsylvania Supreme Court interpreting the Pennsylvania Constitution, not the Federal Takings Clause. Most states have said this is that limits on zoning do not go this far. And so today we're going to talk about the Federal Takings Clause, which has been interpreted somewhat more narrowly. But so why would the law ever be okay saying a city can do this, can say to someone who's using a home in a lawful way or a property in a lawful way, you have to stop? Well, sometimes there are legitimate needs to do so, because otherwise you can't do long-term city planning very well. Sometimes you can't do, you can't adopt mechanisms to address problems as they arise. And so there might be a legitimate need to do this, but there's also a risk that the city is going to abuse this by going after disfavored uses, and that if property developers know that this is a possibility, they're going to be more careful when they are investing in new development. They might think, well, if we build this new development, the city's just going to shut us down. And so the Pennsylvania court here says a city can't do this. It winds up grandfathering in any use that predates the zoning rule. This is the minority rule. Most states say that the city can do this. They just have to give the property owner a reasonable amortization period to recoup their investment. So instead of 90 days, probably like 5 to 10 years. And the economics suggests that that's right, that the concurrence had it right here, that most states have it right, that this is going too far. On the theory that no investment lasts forever. You always need to renovate or tear down and rebuild after a certain number of years, or move to a new location or something. And so if the adult bookstore here got 10 years before they had to move, that might have been enough time to recoup their investment. And then if they move again, if they move in 10 years, it's not like the city can just shut them down immediately again. They have to give them another 10 years in their new location. The bigger problem, though, with this decision is that it creates this asymmetry between land that has been improved and land that has not yet been improved. So if you have land that you haven't developed yet, like we saw in Ambler Realty, where they had vacant land that they were trying to purchase as an investment, or that they had purchased as an investment, planning to develop it later, under Ambler Realty, it's fine for a zoning change to reduce its value substantially. So there it was 75% allegedly. But if you have property that you have already started using, then under this decision, it's illegal to make a zoning change that reduces its value, or at least one that has as significant effect as an Ambler Realty. And so that encourages a rush to improve property as quickly as possible, even though there are probably good reasons to wait in many cases. So economically, there may be no real difference between being deprived of an existing right to use an existing use and being deprived of an existing right to build a development at a future point. And so law that treats the two differently will lead to some economic inefficiencies. It will lead people to developing earlier than they might otherwise develop. And so this is an example of a anti-conservation or pro-development bias in property law that we've seen a couple of other times here. So for instance, when we talked about the oil and gas cases or the water law cases, in Colorado and other Western states, we discussed how the water law was designed to encourage productive uses of the limited water resources. And that's good in terms of using a resource, but it gives people an incentive to rush to start using the water, even if waiting 6 months might lead to a more efficient or more productive use of the water. And so that's something that in water law, we might have some remedies for. We might say, like, the fact that you can sell your water rights helps solve that. Here, that's much less clear. Or, imagine something like, Pearson v. Post about the fox, where, the court was expressly trying to come up with a rule that would encourage people to murder as many foxes as possible, right? Or the whaling case, same thing, where that may not be the right goal. And so here it might not be the right goal to encourage people to build as many adult bookstores as quickly as possible. And then finally, at the end, we turn to Stoyanov, State ex rel Stoyanov versus Berkeley, which deals with aesthetic zoning. And so the question of what sorts of public interests are important enough to justify zoning? Is it a reasonable justification to say, we just want a town that doesn't look ugly? And so the Stoyanovs wanted to build this modern looking house in a neighborhood where the zoning rules required more traditional architecture, and the zoning board says no. And the Missouri court wasn't willing to say that aesthetic concerns alone were enough to justify the zoning rule, but it held that protecting property values was enough. And it relied on these proxies for property values of aesthetics. And so it's not the most factually successful opinion because the court winds up pointing to some fairly sketchy evidence of a decline in value, right? These opinions that are not justified by any specific comparators or anything. But it said, well, the point of zoning is to maintain property values. We think building this pyramid is going to reduce the neighbor's property values. Therefore, it's totally reasonable to block the pyramid. Today, most courts go even further. Most courts say that zoning on purely aesthetic grounds is totally fine. Maybe to avoid the kinds of proof problems that arose in Stoyanov, but also maybe just on the theory that, it's a legit government interest to say we want our town to be pretty, which we could debate. And so this is a good example of this clash between individual liberty and community cohesiveness or democratic self-government or something that has been one of the themes for this last third of the course, where, if you tell the Stoyanovs that you can't build this modern house, it's forcing them to conform to majority sentiments or to move somewhere else. Is that a good thing? Well, this can facilitate the sorting of like-minded people into geographic areas, right? So if we have this neighborhood of traditionalists and this neighborhood of hipsters and whatever, and there's a lot of evidence that empirically people tend to like that sort of clustering, although there's also a lot of evidence that it's maybe not in their long-term interests or in society's long-term interests. And so this kind of aesthetic conformity seems to suggest that the people of this town assign a value to having a neighborhood all of traditional homes at the cost of substantial limitations on the Stoyanovs. There are probably also some expressive interests here, although the First Amendment has not been applied by the courts in these kinds of cases. The other big question, besides just, is this a legit ground to do zoning, is this kind of ordinance too vague to be enforceable? And so the court here thought it was fine, although some other cases reject this kind of zoning ordinance on vagueness grounds. Maybe it was fine here because this house was well outside the mainstream. There was no real ambiguity with respect to this home, while something a little closer to the line might present a harder as applied question. Or maybe it was fine because there was an expert architecture board to make the decisions. That's what the court sort of puts its hat on. But we might also ask, is vagueness a good thing or a bad thing here? Because it's sort of a classic rules versus standards question, where if we have vagueness, it's going to create some unpredictability and waste as people have to go back to the drawing board or throw out the plans that their architect spent a bunch of time and money on. It might deter some investment. It might lead to arbitrary or corrupt government decisions. But it's not clear that clarity is much better, because clarity might constrain free expression and innovation, and it might be wasteful in its own ways, because then, you're basically saying, here's sort of a gallery of permitted house styles, right? And that gallery of styles might not, provide something that fits a family's needs. And so the easy answer to all of this might be to say that aesthetic zoning is just invalid. And that's all fine and good until someone builds an ugly pyramid next to you and suddenly your property values fall. Or, you know, a liquor store or a cement plant or something, right? So if the court was right, if the experts were right that the look of one person's house can really affect the neighbors, then fixing that problem is kind of the core purpose of zoning. And it might be the case that there's not much of a better way to do it than something like this, where you have an architectural board. So that's where we got last time. I do have a couple of last points on this case I was going to discuss. But before we turn to that, any questions on anything we talked about last time? Okay, so the last point I wanted to bring up about Stoyanov is the question of whether it would be better to delegate this kind of responsibility to a board with a bunch of architects or a board of lay people, which is how some other jurisdictions do it. Anybody have any thoughts on the advantage of one of those approaches? Like, this court seemed to take some comfort in the fact that the members of this architectural board are architects, and so they have some expertise. What do we think? Mr. Papavasilio.
I think one point for the architects is they might be more likely to appreciate more controversial or less. I would think that like the average person is going to want things that really conform. An architect or an expert might appreciate stylistic changes or developments and kind of have a more.
So maybe they're more likely to appreciate innovation and you know,
yeah, exactly,
lack of conformity. Ms. Solomon?
I would say that the argument for having lay people is that they could tell you like what they would want in their neighborhood, and like if they would buy a house next to another house that's kind of weird or non-conforming because they're the consumers in the market.
Yeah, so they're sort of more representative of the affected people. Yeah. Mr. Buchanan.
Yeah, I mean, what's the problem with having a combination of both so that you can get both of those sides? You know, that's definitely something that I feel is feasible and wouldn't impede on either one of them, their opinions.
That's potentially a really useful approach, right? Because then you get both perspectives and they can have a discussion that brings in both perspectives. Ms. Elaine Winchester. You're still muted. Mr. Syed, did you have a, oh, go ahead.
Okay. I think that the board should be always comprised of people who live in that community, because the idea is that they have a stake in the outcome of decisions that are made by that board. If it was comprised strictly of architectural professionals who don't live in the community, that could be problematic.
But better to have architects who live in the community or to have like normal people?
A mix of both if there are architects that live in the community, but absent the fact that they live in the community, I think it'd be better to have community members versus professionals.
What kind of architects do we think are gonna like be wound up being appointed to these boards?
Is that a question for me or for everybody?
Or for anyone, if you have thoughts on it, anyone who does, feel free to chime in. Mr. Goldstein? Mr. Hoffman?
Yeah, so my opinion is that a lot of modern architects or modern architecture movements are like brutalist and abstract, not unlike a lot of art. And so, you know, a historian comprised board would want all traditional buildings. I think it would be best instead to have service industry people, the folks that will be repairing the building on the board, since they know what's most useful. And if a building is going to fall apart after 30 years, that's clearly not a very smart thing to build.
Well, maybe not, right? Like there's plenty of, I mean, I grew up in Houston, which like has no buildings that were built after like 1975, right? Or earlier than 1975, right? So like that's a slight exaggeration, but only slight. I mean, if you're in a quick moving community, maybe rebuilding every 30 years is reasonable. I don't know, Mr. Goldstein.
Yeah, one kind of real life example I grew up with is my father was a builder on Cape Cod, which is home of the Old Kings Highway Historic Commission, which regulates houses across several towns on Cape Cod, all connected by Route 6A, and they restrict everything from, you know, colors to historic designs. And so as a builder, he was subject to those rules. And now that he's retired, he actually sits on the board as an alternate. So while he's not an architect by any professional certifications, he did design a lot of the houses he built over the years and learned how to conform to these codes while still bringing modern features and comforts to some of these homes affected by this, by these zoning rules. And so I think, you know, people like that, I forget who just spoke, but yeah, the people not necessarily fixing, but working on these homes, building these homes, who have a better understanding of what it takes to comply, have some insight. But I think the board was mixed with just citizens and local builders and contractors. So it kind of had a breadth of experience.
Yeah, there's it, like that's actually fairly representative of the boards, right? You don't tend to get a lot of like Frank Gary's and I.M. Pei's because they're, you know, too busy to do this kind of thing, right? You get a lot of retired architects and retired builders and sometimes architects with like part-time practices, right? So to the extent that we're talking about how, you know, architects are more likely to bring in like modern innovative designs, maybe, maybe not, right? Mr. Carney?
Yeah, that's basically what I was going to say, that I kind of, Chris was saying there'd be more creativity with architects, but I don't know if that's necessarily the case because there's more conformity to existing standards. And according to the Fountainhead, Howard Rourke, you know, that book by, you know, that's all about architects and individualism. So
I'm going to stay away from that one. I mean, so like one cure for vagueness here, right, is having an expert board like this court approves, but another one might be precision. So, you know, we could say like, here is a set of approved plans. You have to build one of those. That would solve the corruption problem and the waste problem. Any problems that it would create? Mr. Huffman, you had your hand up for a moment, so I apologize. Go ahead.
All right, I took it down.
Okay. I mean, would we dislike if we had like, here's the approved 3-bedroom style, here's the approved 4-bedroom style, here's the approved 5-bedroom style, and you can paint one of these 5 colors? Ms. Trotz?
My fear with the precision kind of regulations would just be like waste created by human error. Like I know this one situation where, you know, there were these certain colors that people could paint their houses and someone like swapped the color of the trim with the color of the house.
Oh,
And they had to like totally repaint. Like, I guess that's the first thing that comes to mind for me.
so maybe we'd have to like, you know, consider enforcement. Like maybe you know, it wouldn't be like you'd have to repaint. You'd just have to, you know, generally conform. I don't know, who would want to live in a community that said like, here are the 4 approved architectures, like the 4 approved designs for a house? Mr. Herzl?
I would not want to live in a place like that, but I was going to say this is the basis for Levittowns. Like, you know, all of the houses look exactly the same. There's literally 3 colors, but I think it goes beyond the alienability of property, when instead of having like minimum standards of like safety and codes and things like that, you get into like the very specific details of like, it has to be this shade of green, it can't be that shade of green, and it has to have a living room of this size and things like that. So
Yeah. Ms. Mattel?
Yeah, I was just, these boards that you talk about, if they're composed of architects or lay people, this is for like an entire town or an entire city, right? Like it's not just for a neighborhood? Like, hypothetically?
It could be, or it could be something more limited. So like, for instance, in Washington, DC, the Georgetown neighborhood is a historic district that has its own architecture board and has to approve development there. So like, when Apple wanted to open an Apple store in Georgetown, they had a lot of trouble getting approval from the architecture board, and they went back and forth several times. And the architecture board kept saying, no, you can't just build a giant glass cube, right? And they, eventually caved and kind of, built something that was Georgetown style. But so that's sort of, a particular neighborhood.
Yeah. I mean, my personal opinion, and maybe I'm just like too radical, but like, I just don't see the argument or the persuasiveness of having an entire board determine what architectural structures are allowed for like an entire city or an entire town. Because I just feel like that just stomps on creativity or self-expression.
Yeah.
And I don't know.
That's the downside.
And the argument like, oh, it's going to lower, the prices of other towns around. It's like, well, who cares? Then lower them and whatever. Then maybe we can afford more diverse people.
I was going to say, you like that until you own one of those neighboring homes, and then you're like, taking pitchforks to City Hall and, demanding
you're totally right. Like, I'm saying this and like, obviously, like, I don't own any home right now, but I mean, I don't know. I like creative neighborhoods where there's funky houses, and I feel bad for the people that can't build those because there's these boards that say they can't.
I mean, so in the chat, Mr. Watt says, go look at the Dunkin' Donuts in New London, New Hampshire. You can hardly tell it's a Dunkin' Donuts. Yeah, there's lots of interesting places that are like that. So if you think about like, a lot of like sort of high-end resort towns will have very strict aesthetic zoning. And so you'll have like, a McDonald's on the main drag that looks nothing like a McDonald's, right? That looks like, this beautiful modernist architecture, like, fancy log cabin that has a tiny little McDonald's sign somewhere on it. A bunch of hands. Let me throw out one more option, and then we'll turn to the folks with their hands up. So we could have like a board of architects or a board of citizens or a mixed board, or we could have like rules instead of standards where we have, here are the approved designs. Maybe a third option is, instead of having either, we could have something like any house designed by a licensed architect is okay, right? And so instead of having rules or standards that are enforced by a board, have like professional norms. So like, in the criminal justice system, we say, you don't have the right to a fair trial by the best attorney, or a trial that like complies with certain like bright line rules or something. We say if you have a reasonable trial according to a normal attorney, that's good enough, right? We could say something like this, where if you have a design that a licensed professional architect with an architecture background approved, it's presumably not going to be total garbage, right? What do we think of that approach? Mr. Mayor, I think I had you first. You are muted.
Oh, sorry. I'll actually, pass on this.
Mr. Saya?
Yeah, actually, I just want to clarify your question. So is it something that, you give the plan or the request to come up with an architectural plan to a licensed architect?
So like, yeah, I'm not sure I followed the clarification. So
yeah,
let
could
me
you
just
please reiterate the question that you asked?
So instead of like a board that approves individual designs, or like rules that are like, here are the requirements and here's what your house must look like, just say, instead of enforcing it through rules or standards, say, we're going to have like professional licensing and professional norms, and that will avoid having, buildings that are too ugly.
I'm thinking about an example that, for example, so you want to build a house in Back Bay, for example, in Boston, so that most of the houses have a particular shape or even the windows, and you ask a a licensed architect in California or San Diego that come up with the design for me. And of course, that person is not familiar with even the atmospheric situation in Boston, how much precipitation that Boston receives, and all these kind of different codes, and from beauty perspective and city perspective. And then in that case, so you create a bunch of other problems, right? And
yeah, speaking of Apple stores, right? So like, like the Apple store on Boylston in Boston, which I just put a photo in the chat, right? That does not fit in at all to the surrounding neighborhood or the surrounding buildings, right? Mr. Buchanan?
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Arash just said there. And also, there might be architects that come into the town that people don't know about, and their first architectural design that they come up with would be pretty appalling to the
Would
people.
be a glass pyramid.
Yeah. So I feel like having that, designation for architects, everything an architect comes up with is fine, wouldn't bode well for some of the people in the community.
And I mean, when I say would be a glass pyramid, like you said, yeah, like that was a good example of the kind that would be appalling. I think that would be beautiful, right? So it's one of those things where it's like hard to tell. Ms. Sullivan?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think that like having a board with lay people and architects on it would kind of create a good middle ground where you don't have these strict rules, but you don't also give complete deference just to architects. And if that kind of creates all the buildings looking the same, well, that's what the people in the community want. A lot of like new developments that we have these days, all the houses look exactly the same and people are buying them. So obviously that's what people in those communities want.
Yeah, but those people might be wrong, right? I mean, it might be our duty to help them discover the joy of glass pyramids. Mr. Spencer.
Yeah, I didn't catch who said it. I think it might have been Amanda, but I agree completely. I think the zoning boards stifle creativity 100%. And it's interesting to go, if you see a place.
Well, but hold on, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It's a very bad thing. Think about, I mean, I'm not an architect, but I love to look at the buildings as much as anybody else. And I like to read how styles develop over the years. And now there isn't really much development, and there can't be in a large part of the country because they're locked into doing the houses one way. And people can't really experiment at all and come up with something new.
Mr. Watts?
I mean, I know this might be kind of
and I'm going to have to cut off the comments pretty soon because we have to move on. But anyway, go ahead.
I know this might be practically challenging, but what about just like putting it on a ballot for the community members to vote on, like as a whole?
For every fucking house?
Well, for anything that people like that goes outside of some sort of norm, right? So maybe the like zoning board can raise a red flag and then people have to veto it or something, right? So like if you want a pyramid and if like, less than 2/3 of people don't object to it or something, right? If 2/3 of the community says we don't want a pyramid, then fine, no pyramid. But if, only like 50%, it's like, okay, well then maybe we should let this pyramid happen. I don't know. It seems like practically it could be challenging, but it seems like it would allow for more fair outcomes in a community-based way.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's kind of the point of the requirements that like people post permits on construction sites so that, or notice that there's going to be a hearing on this date or whatever, so that like the people who live on the same block or like a block away or whatever can go to the hearing and offer public comments to say, I don't want to live next to that ugly thing, right? Which is sort of a form of that without the voting, although it might be a useful form of that because it sort of puts a cost on expressing that opinion because you have to like show up and, speak and stuff in a way that limits it to people who really like strongly care, right? I mean, imposing costs on this is bad, but also good. Ms. Attenborough.
I sort of had a question, like, would courts look more kindly on restrictions that are meant to enforce historical norms? And like, if there's a neighborhood that's super historic, so they want to preserve that, would a court look at that as that's a legitimate reason?
It's certainly a more common reason. I don't know if I can't think of any doctrinal reason it would be favored over just a purely like aesthetic, but it's certainly the reason a lot of communities would try to do that, right? Because it's really hard to imagine a neighborhood where like the zoning rules are every house must be like modern and cool and different, right? Although there are things like Times Square where there is a requirement of like a certain number of electronic signs on every building, which is, you know, I guess sort of the opposite. Okay, Mr. Spencer, last comment on this, and then we have to move on.
Sure. I was just going to say, it's not a bad idea to have a 2/3 majority, but I just don't like the idea of your neighbors getting to vote on what your house is. I mean, there's so many buildings that were, every building was always the first one of its kind at some point. Every style started where some spot. And if everybody voted, maybe a lot of things would never have been built. Like
yeah, so that's the sort of procreative argument, right? That like, you know, a lot of art that was, or a lot of, you know, architecture and literature and everything that was sort of controversial and hated at the time wound up becoming classic, right? And so it takes a certain amount of boldness a lot of the time to do something new and different and innovative. But the other side of the coin is why I asked if it's a good thing or a bad thing to stifle creativity, is if it's really true that like a house on your block affects your property, whether that's values or just like your, you know, feeling living there, then of course the neighbors should have some influence over the process, right? Like if I bought a, you know, lot 3 doors down from you and I turned it into, you know, a 24-hour nightclub, that would bug you because of the noise, right? I guess a 24-hour nightclub doesn't make sense, right? But like a, you know, a nightclub that kept you up at night, a day nightclub, I don't know, a club. And you would have some concerns about that, even though you'd be stifling creativity by doing so. Okay, I said this would be the last one, so I have to make it the last one. Any questions about that? Okay, so let's move on to Mount Laurel, which is the last of our examples of the uses of zoning expanding over time. So in 1975, Mount Laurel was this developing suburb of Philadelphia and Camden, and basically used its zoning system to exclude all low-income housing. So all of the town basically was zoned either for industrial use or detached single-family residences or retail. There was no zone that permitted multifamily housing development. And you know, one way that it was permitted was that they allowed these 3 planned development units, plant unit developments, where they could have apartments and townhouses, but the city zoning rules required those developments to have certain fairly expensive amenities. So they had to have central air conditioning, they had to have a certain number of bedrooms, et cetera. And so they tended not to be low-income housing. And so the NAACP sued, saying basically the town has structured its zoning system to exclude poor residents and minority residents, and that violates the state and federal law. Note, by the way, that this is not Euclidean zoning. So in Euclid, all the zones were cumulative. So zone 1 was only single family homes and a few other things. And then zone 2 added duplexes, and zone 3 added apartments, and zone 4, 5, 6 added industrial, where like in zone 6, the industrial use, you could have apartments or single family homes if you wanted. This is not that. The industrial zones only allow industrial, and the single family residential zones only allow single family residential. If this was Euclidean zoning, there'd be no problem because you could build whatever kind of residences you want in all of the industrial land, a bunch of which was vacant. So I guess the first big question is, why did they do this? Why do they want to exclude low-income residents? Is Amber in?
Well, the casebook said that they did it in order to keep basically their like tax base up, or maybe that's the wrong term for it, but they wanted people.
No, that's exactly the right term.
Okay. Wanted people who could pay their own way. They didn't want people with like too many kids flooding their school system, costing them money. They didn't want poor people, basically.
And so basically, like the way the state has set up its tax system creates this screwed up set of incentives, right? Where state law says most of the cost of providing local government services is on the property owners. And the most expensive government services are schools. And so if you have a lot of kids, you need a lot of schools. And if you have a lot of, families, you need a lot of schools. If you have a lot of industrial land, they pay a lot of taxes. They don't really need that many services. So it's sort of profitable for the city, right? Whereas if you have a lot of families with young kids, and in particular, a lot of low income families, your tax rate has to be really high in order to pay for all those schools. And so this was the city's argument that like this is not our doing, this is the state's doing on, imposed on us. And, every time you have a low income family that doesn't pay that much in property taxes, but takes up like a spot or two in the public schools, that's a, financial loss that we have to make up through higher taxes. That was their argument. There's obviously a race issue too, at least if the NAACP is the lead plaintiff, right? So in 1970, the then mayor of Mount Laurel went to a black church and told the congregants, quote, "If you people can't afford to live in our town, then you'll just have to move." But the court winds up deciding the case without discussing animus. Basically, they say that like the economics are enough to decide this case. So basically, we kind of have this collective action problem where all of the suburbs in the town have strong incentives to drive out the poorer families and the families with young kids and kind of try to dump them on the cities. Why don't the cities do the same thing? Like if you're Camden or Trenton or Newark or something, why not do the exact same thing? Is Edinburgh?
I'm from this area, so it just might not be that, it might be that the people don't want to live in those cities.
Mm-hmm.
Like if they force out lower income people, it's not like upper income families are going to move to Camden.
Yeah, it's not like they're going to easily attract the sort of attractive tax-paying, rich people in industrial uses. Ms. Harmison?
I was gonna say that in cities there's like way more jobs. There's a lot to do in a city to keep it running. So I think a poor population is integral because they're able to do those jobs.
And even if, even if it's not sort of, we have to have poor people to do, the work, like if you have a lot of industry and a lot of commercial property use, those tend to be higher paying taxpayers anyway, right? And so the fact that cities are naturally attracting those taxpayers means that maybe like they're not as dependent on like the residential property taxes to fund the schools, right? Like they can depend in some part on the industrial and commercial property taxpayers. But also the cities already have a lot of people in them, right? So it's hard to like get rid of them versus like a suburb that already doesn't have apartments. It's much easier to keep them out, right? So if this is a problem that is sort of a collective action problem of the state as a whole, where all of the suburbs are trying to drive out their poor residents, why doesn't the state act? Like, why doesn't the state legislature, impose a requirement that every suburb take their fair share of poor residents, or reform the school funding system? Ms. Edinburgh?
The representatives, I guess I wouldn't want my representative advocating that my town had to take in people who wouldn't pay as much in taxes. So there's no like legislative real benefit to doing that. And since all these cities want to force these people out, or all these towns want to force these people out, they end up sort of clumped in cities. So there's not as much representation and there's sort of no benefit. And in areas where there's higher taxes, specifically in New Jersey, areas where there's higher taxes are going to be the ones with a lot more political power. So there's no one to sort of do that.
Yeah, the political power story is very much the root cause here, right? Like suburbs often have a ton of political power, wealthy suburbs in particular, right? Because they have a lot of people, but also because the people tend to be highly engaged and, willing to make noise and make trouble, right? And so even if we have a problem that is sort of a collective action problem where the state as a whole could solve it, that's going to be a really heavy lift politically. And we've seen this in a lot of states, like New Hampshire recently, had the state school funding system declared unconstitutional by the state and or by the courts. And, coming up with a system to reform that has been a massive battle. And that's true kind of everywhere. So that's what leads to this problem. Like, these towns see zoning as a tool to accomplish this goal. The state doesn't have the political capital to make it so that this is not a goal that all the towns have. And so the court says, well, we can solve this. Every community, or at least every developing community, whatever that means, must presumptively make possible a variety of housing types and situations, right? So low and moderate income housing, at least according to the extent of that community's fair share of the regional needs. Why? What's the legal source of this duty? This is sort of what makes this such a weird, fascinating opinion. Yeah, Ms. Elaine Winchester.
So the rationale, I guess, would be that all of the land is controlled by the state, and the municipalities are the subdelegates or subdivisions of the state itself. So because they have to set aside their own fair share of land for lower income housing, and can't, out of necessity and out of equity, force people to live only on, poorly used land or in dilapidated houses or anything like that, and retain all of the valuable real estate for more well-to-do residents out of this equity, this fair share.
So is that a constitutional holding or what?
It is. The state has a constitutional obligation to all of the residents, yes, whether they're rich or poor, out of the due process, 14th Amendment.
Well, so it's a state holding, right? It is definitely not a 14th Amendment holding. Ms. Amberton?
I'm not sure that I entirely understand the reasoning, but they say in the opinion that the land use regulation is encompassed with the police power. And so just like with zoning, they can promote health, safety, and morals. They have to also with providing the different types of housing.
Mm-hmm. This is the weird thing, right? This is all on 1088 and 1089. And so, yeah, toward the top of 1088, land use regulation is encompassed within the state's police power, which is sort of the affirmative power of the state government to legislate to further the health and safety and welfare generally of the people of that state, right? And then these two paragraphs that say it is elementary and it is required are fascinating, right? So it is elementary theory that all police power enactments, no matter at what level of government, must conform to the basic constitutional requirements of substantive due process and equal protection. That makes it sound like this is sort of a 14th Amendment equal protection substantive due process holding, right? But that's not really where they go with it. They then say, it is required that affirmatively a zoning regulation, like any police power enactment, must promote public health, safety, morals, or the general welfare. The last term seems broad enough to encompass the others. Conversely, a zoning enactment which is contrary to the general welfare is invalid. Okay, so if you pass a bad law that doesn't actually help people, it's invalid. That's a little aggressive, but sure. And then they talk about how that is what the zoning regulation says is its purpose. And then toward the bottom of that page, the paragraph that starts at the bottom of 1088 and continues over onto 1089, the warning implicates the matter of whose general welfare must be served or not violated in the field of land use regulation. Frequently, the decisions in this state have spoken only in terms of the interest of the enacting municipality, so that it has been thought, at least in some quarters, that such was the only welfare requiring consideration. It is, of course, true that many cases have dealt only with regulations having little, if any, outside impact. However, it is fundamental and not to be forgotten that zoning power is a police power of the state, and the local authority is acting only as a delegate of that power and is restricted in the same manner as the state. And so, when regulation does have a substantial external impact, the welfare of the state's citizens beyond the borders of the particular municipality cannot be disregarded. And then maybe 10, 15 lines down, the universal and constant need for such housing is so important and of such broad public interest that the general welfare which developing municipalities like Mount Laurel must consider extends beyond their boundaries and cannot be parochially confined to the claimed good of the particular municipality. So basically, the state has delegated zoning power to the cities, and by fragmenting that power across a bunch of municipalities, the state doesn't have the power to let each of those municipalities consider only its own interest. They have to consider the interests of the state as a whole. So if you're, Concord, you have to consider the value, you have to consider the, effect on Manchester and the effect on Bow and et cetera, right? What do we think of that analysis? Mr. Ridolph.
I'm not sure how relevant this is at all, but it made me think about the fact that New Hampshire is not a home rule state. Towns are only allowed to do that which they're expressly given by the state legislature.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I don't know how relevant that is, but I was just thinking about that while reading this case. And
yeah. And in some sense, that is always true, right? Because towns and cities and counties and every unit of local government only exists to the extent the state says it can, right?
That's true, but up in Maine, you have towns that are passing plastic bans and stuff, and I'm not certain that would be allowed in a New Hampshire town.
Yeah, the difference is that Maine says, we allow there to be cities, and by the way, cities can do whatever they want to govern locally, right?
Right.
Versus here, they say, we establish towns and cities, and they can do the following things, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's very involved of the court to do this, but apparently it was addressing something that was greatly needed. So that's just my take on it.
It's definitely a very aggressive interpretation, right? Normally we would say it's well within a town's police power, at least the fundamental concept of the police power, to do things that are for the benefit of the local town. Cities and states compete all the time to recruit businesses and residents and stuff, right? And so normally we wouldn't say if a state gives a company a tax credit to come to that state from another state, that's, they have to consider the benefits to the other state as well, right? Or same like within a state, like if one city offered a tax credit to businesses moving from another city within the state, we would say, yeah, that's totally fine. That's part of like the competition and that'll lead to better government overall. But here it seems like the level of general welfare is defined at such a demanding level that you can't do that kind of thing. But like you said, there were sort of unusual circumstances here that created what was at least thought of as a real significant problem. And maybe this court thought we have to do something dramatic, right? I mean, another dramatic thing here was the remedy. So what was the remedy this court ordered? Ms. Dowd?
The court gave the town 90 days to incrementally improve their existing zoning ordinances based on the observations in the trial court, the findings.
Yeah, it said you have some time to make this better, right?
Mhm.
The town basically fails to comply. The town basically, changes the rules in bad faith. Like it rezoned like 1/400th of the land to allow for multifamily homes. And it put those zones right next to massive industrial zones. So this case is already interminably edited, right? It is absurdly long. I didn't assign it, but in the notes, there is this extensive discussion of what came next. And so the next step is this case comes back to the state Supreme Court in a case called Mount Laurel 2, where the court says, okay, if the town's not going to solve the problem, we will. And so it does a few things. One, it says, no, this requirement applies to every suburb, not just developing suburbs. And then two, it creates what's called a builder's remedy. So a builder's remedy is that if a town failed to satisfy its obligations under Mount Laurel, if it basically still made it impossible to build low-income housing, then a developer can go to court for approval instead. And so basically there were two ways to get permits to build. You can go through the city permit process, or you can go to court and say, look, the city is being worthless. Like, why don't you go ahead and give me a judicial order that said I can go ahead? So I guess first, like, why didn't this opinion go ahead and do that in the first place? Mr. Papavasilio?
It's probably a reluctance for a court to sign itself up to then have to deal with everybody. They become the zoning board then. And I'm sure they'd like to find a better way.
Yeah, it's not really their expertise and it's kind of a pain in the ass, right? So they don't really want to get the court sort of permanently in the position of like, running a permitting process. It's a court.
Yeah. And I think also that I think the court, I mean, I might be reading this into the opinion, but I understood the arguments the town was making. It was, it was acting based on the rules. It was acting to its own advantage, but no one had told it that it had to worry about people outside of its town before. So I think the court might have also been reticent of over penalizing them or over strong arming them.
Yeah, there's a legitimacy concern about if you order this remedy without giving the democratic process a chance to fix it, it's a little heavy-handed. Might as well see if they'll fix it first, right? And then they showed that no, in fact, they were, not willing to do so. One of the things Mount Laurel 2 does is appoint these 3 judges to supervise all of the builder's remedy litigation in the future. Basically, like these 3 judges will develop expertise. They'll become kind of this little zoning board. What do we think of the builder's remedy? Is this like a good, free market solution, or is this like a potential for abuse? What do we think? Mr. Andrews?
Well, it provides a strong incentive for towns to have reasonable guidelines, because then they can at least have some kind of say as to how their town's zoned, where if they are unwilling to do so, then the developers will simply bypass them and go to the courts.
Yeah, better to have some control than no control at all, right? Like it's going to give the developers a lot of power. They can kind of go to the suburb and say, hey, you know, we know that this zoning rule says we have to do X, Y, and Z, but it would be really great if we could do Q instead, because otherwise we're going to have to go to the 3 judges, right? And so like that's the potential for abuse, although you're right, it's like another way to frame it is it's a strong incentive for towns to cooperate. Ms. Trouts?
Oh yeah, I think I was going to say something along that.
I mean, it's
What
also,
Kate-
it's,
yeah.
yeah, it's also useful in that like it says to developers, you know, if you want to help solve the problem of a lack of affordable housing, you're not going to get sort of stuck in permit hell forever. And so maybe they'll be more willing to do so, right? After Mount Laurel 2, the New Jersey legislature enacted this Fair Housing Act, which created a council on affordable housing, which wound up implementing a bunch of the things the Supreme Court said in Mount Laurel 2, but it got rid of the builder's remedy. It also said a suburb can pay another city or town to absorb some of that suburb's fair share. And so if you're a town that you really don't want to have a bunch of poor people with schools, you can, you know, pay Camden to absorb that part of your burden. What do we think of that? Ms. Dowd?
It sounds like some of the separate but equal cases that went to the Supreme Court when they were saying, hey, we'll just send our African American students out of state and give you a voucher. It doesn't seem like a great solution. It still seems elitist.
Oh, it's definitely elitist, right? It's like how Mount Laurel and you know, towns in New Jersey like remain wealthy and you know, child free, right? Mr. Buchanan?
Yeah, I feel like you also have to do a job following where that money goes after giving it to a town like Camden, because you want to make sure that that money is going to the residents of Camden who are, you know, lower class and who don't have the necessary housing. So I feel like there would have to be a substantial amount of follow-up as well with where that money goes through the town system.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, that there wouldn't normally be a requirement to that effect, right? Like if Mount Laurel has to run schools, it can run cheap schools and put the money in, you know, the retreat for the city council in Bermuda or whatever. Mr. Little.
I was just going to say, practically speaking, like thinking about the actual families themselves, you know, maybe they don't want to live in Camden. I've been to Camden, New Jersey, and I wouldn't want to live there. So just, it seems like it kind of takes like the individual out of the equation.
Yeah, it's definitely, it seems like it's aimed at basically perpetuating the existing system, right? Of like the poor people live in the cities and are concentrated there, and the rich suburbs can kind of wash their hands of that whole situation, right? And that's probably a bad thing overall. Like there's a lot of evidence that if you know, have mixed neighborhoods where you have low income residents and upper income residents in sort of the same areas, they're much more likely to, you know, have good outcomes in life, right? Versus like, let's just pay the crappy city schools to take all of our poor people, right? That's much less likely to solve the problem in the long term. This is sort of, again, the idea of like homogenous communities from homeowners associations, except like also at a wealth level and sort of a race level, right? On the other hand, it at least makes use of the existing housing stock, and it gives the cities some money to pay for their schools, right? And so maybe they can improve them. So the postscript of this, and then we'll take our break after this, is that the project that was that started this whole controversy in Mount Laurel was not approved until 1997, years after this. It opened in 2002. But it was this great natural experiment, right? Because you have this low income development and they assigned the units in the development to those who applied by lottery. And so it's this great natural experiment for social scientists to look at the effects of having low income housing in a high income city. And what they found was that a decade after the development opened, the residents who won spots in the development and wound up moving to Mount Laurel, compared to those who didn't win, but who were otherwise similar, had dramatically lower levels of welfare reliance and neighborhood disorder, higher levels of employment, higher wages. Their kids spent more time studying and reading, although, there was no significant increase in academic performance that was observed, but still the kids spent more time studying. That's probably a good thing. And that there was no significant downside. So even in the wealthy neighborhoods that were closest to the affordable development, property values were unaffected. And there was no increase in crime. There was no increase in any, downsides, right? And so the study said, to most residents, the fact that there was this pocket of poor families in Mount Laurel proved entirely irrelevant to their lives. And that when they did surveys, many of the wealthy Mount Laurel residents had no idea that this development existed. It wasn't like a controversial thing in the town. It was something people didn't even know about. And that's sort of a fascinating story because it suggests that a lot of the resistance to this from the wealthy areas may be driven by fears that are not backed by reality. And that this kind of intervention by the courts, may solve a real political problem, because if this is something that the political process won't voluntarily do, then if the court can do it, everyone will wind up better off. And so that makes it seem like this is sort of a classic 1970s liberal big government court sort of interpreting the state constitution in this very aggressive way to, solve social problems, right? Which is very much a, liberal Warren Court ACS member type of thing to like, right? And the conventional response is for, modern conservative, judicial proponents to be very concerned about this. But the counter side that is worth considering or the counter argument that's worth considering is that it's a liberal court using a free market mechanism, because the mechanism that the court was using was removing barriers to free market developers coming in building low income developments, right? And so in some sense, this is a very activist court using these very free market tools to solve activist court types of problems. And that's a very unusual thing, but empirically it seems to have been very successful, which maybe offers lessons for other problems that come up because of these sorts of political problems. Okay, so that's Mount Laurel. We could talk for another 5 hours about that case if we wanted, but we don't have time. So any questions or final thoughts on it? Let's take a 10-minute break and then we'll come back and we will talk about takings for 40 minutes. Okay, so I'll say a few words introducing takings and then we'll turn to Kela versus New London. Oh, one more thing I should say before we do that. I realized I have neglected to do something I am supposed to do, which is give everyone 10 minutes to fill out course evaluations. So we may have time to do that today, or I may just have to ask you to do them on your own time. I apologize for forgetting about that. But I encourage everyone to fill them out. They are useful tools to come up with things to try to improve about the course. So, and I thank you in advance. Okay, so takings. So I'm going to say a few words about it before we turn to Kilo. So in this spectrum of tools that are available to control or regulate or modify how land is used, eminent domain or takings are sort of the most extreme version of this, right? So if we start with trespass law, where you can keep people out of your own property, and then easements and covenants and servitudes and zoning, nuisance law, I forgot. Takings are the most aggressive one. And so eminent domain is this power of the government to just take private land for public use. It's a doctrine that governments have universally recognized for hundreds of years. The Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, the federal Constitution, has the takings clause, which says government can't do this without paying compensation. It doesn't say anything about government having the power in the first place. And so where does it come from? It's just assumed. It's just assumed as like an inherent power of sovereignty. As we know, for a government of limited delegated powers, that is weird, but that's what the courts have said, that, you know, governments just inherently have this power. The takings clause limits that pre-existing power to take land. And so, as always, it's worth starting with the text. So the text says, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. And so that text gives us three issues that come up in takings cases. First, the taking has to be for a public use. So there's the question of what counts as a public use. That is the focus of Kelo. Second, there's the question of what counts as just compensation. And the theory there is fairly easy. It's fair market value. In practice, calculating it and litigating it can be messy and fact intensive. But you don't have a lot of, you know, theory disputes there. And then the third question is sort of the most fundamental one. And that's the question of what counts as taking property in the first place. So in Kelo versus New London, they just took title to the real estate, right? They're like, you're using this real estate to have a house on it. We need it for this development. You have to get out. We're taking it, like it's gone, right? And that's clearly a taking. That is clearly taking away your property. But what if the government changes the law in a way that makes it illegal for you to use your property, or makes it illegal for you to use your property in a way that you have been using it? So if we think back to like the PA, what's the other word of that case name?
Northwestern, PA Northwestern.
PA Northwestern, thank you. We think back to PA Northwestern, right? The court says, if we shut down your adult bookstore with just a 90-day amortization period, that amounts to a taking. Well, they're not taking away the title to the land. They're just changing the law in a way where you can no longer use your property in the way you had been. And so this is what's called the problem of regulatory takings. And I'll say a few words at the end of the class about it. But there is a lot of litigation over whether particular government regulations is enough to amount to taking away your property. And so, as I've said, this is sort of the most aggressive tool the government has for regulating land use. So, you know, your cement plant annoys the neighbors, or stands in the way of a highway, or stands in the way of developing a new, you know, manufacturing facility to redevelop the riverfront. Well, the city will just take it away from you. And so in Kelo, the city wanted to redevelop its waterfront. there was a bunch of empty land on the riverfront. There was a closed naval facility, but there were also some private residences that were in the way. And so the city wanted to condemn those residents to make them part of this larger development. They were hoping that this would attract big companies like Pfizer, which apparently now makes the cool vaccine, I learned today. And so the question was whether taking property from private owners to use for a development that would benefit private owners was a public use or not. So I guess the first question is that here, the development corporation that was created by the government to do this acquired most of the land just by buying it. They exercised eminent domain on 15 parcels, but most of them they just bought. So why not just condemn everything? Why not just take everything? Why buy most of it? Yeah, Mr. Papasilio.
Everyone you buy is a court fight you don't have to have.
Yeah, court fights take years. This one took many years, right? Voluntary sale is much quicker, usually winds up cheaper. You know, lawyers can exercise all of those pieces of Civ Pro that we learned, right? To object and to get discovery and challenge the basis for the taking and challenge the valuation and everything. And so most government agencies are willing to pay more than fair market value just to voluntarily purchase it. Yeah, Mr. Watts.
Well, just if you did this frequently enough, people would probably get upset, basically. If this was a commonplace enough thing that was done as the first choice, I think enough people might say, hey, maybe we want to completely outlaw eminent domain entirely.
Yeah, so that's the one of the costs of doing this is the political cost, right? You have to defend it and justify it and you know, put up with the backlash, right? So the basic question, like I said, is a taking for economic development that will ultimately benefit private companies, can that be a public use? And the court says, yeah, because the precedents require a public benefit. And the public benefit here is, you know, higher tax revenue, something like that, right? There's also this intent element, like the court says, you must intend to further that public purpose. So like a purely private taking that has a pretextual benefit would be unlawful. But that's probably an ineffective check in the real world. Yeah, Ms. Lee.
Professor, I understand that there will be restaurants and hotel and museum on the land.
And then you froze right before you got to your question.
I'm sorry?
And then you froze right before you got to your question.
Am I back now?
Yes, you're back. Go ahead.
There is a Pfizer facility.
And then you froze again. Maybe put it in the chat.
Okay.
Okay, but so here's what I think is kind of the weird mystery here. Like, if this development really is going to be wealth maximizing, if it's going to be best for everyone, why doesn't the free market make it happen? Because this is sort of like the Coase theorem argument, right? That like, if it really is better for the city as a whole to have this be a private development because the tax base is going to be higher, then it's presumably worth more to the city than it is to the individual landowners. So why do we need to make this involuntary? Why can't they just buy all of it? Ms. Attenborough.
Maybe someone just wouldn't accept any price someone was willing to pay. I've had that happen to family where they would not accept any price that a county was willing to pay. So they just went with fair market price, and it, like, you could end up with stubbornness. And then I think it would also, sometimes I think maybe cities assume that it will be less of a court fight. Like maybe the court fight itself wouldn't be as much as in the end they would end up having to pay these people to get them persuaded to leave.
Yeah, that's basically it, right? You have some people who, you know, have no interest in moving at all, period. And they're like, you know, I'm 85, like, I don't care if you want to pay me, you know, $5 million for my house, like, I'm just going to be here, right? This is a form of transaction cost, right? Like, if you're trying to assemble a big chunk of land, then requiring every single seller to agree is going to present massive coordination costs and holdout opportunities. Like, if you know that you are the one property standing in the way of this development, then you can demand, like, not just, you know, double the market value of your house or whatever, but like the value of the whole development, basically, right? And so, like, the prototypical example of this is a highway, where if you want to build a highway, you have to assemble a bunch of pieces of land, and you can't have a highway that has like a house in the middle of it. So, like, if you miss one of them, it's a problem. You would have to like go around it or something. And so when people hear that someone's building a highway, they can basically like start jacking up their price. So they hold out and demand absurd prices, and eminent domain solves that, or, you know, solves that. Maybe that's not a real problem. And so, like, when we were looking back at property rules and liability rules, one of the arguments for a liability rule saying permanent damages for the oil facility or the oil refinery or the cement plant rather than an injunction was that if you have like 100 neighbors, each of whom has a veto over it, the transaction costs are very high of getting to a voluntary deal because of that holdout risk. And this is the exact same story. If you want to build a highway and you have to assemble 100 pieces of land, any one person could veto the whole project, or at least raise its costs significantly. And so, you know, we're not dealing with like a traditional fair market where, you know, everyone has an incentive to get to the fair market value. And so, like, by that view, yeah, Ms. Lee.
Why was the Pfizer also considered a public use? Well, it's a private business.
So we're going to come to that. Although I wanted to respond to the, like, why not have Pfizer buy the last 15 homes? I'm sure they could make a very persuasive offer. Well, Pfizer wasn't necessarily on board here, right? This was the city redeveloping this area, hoping it would attract Pfizer or another big company. Like, no one had yet committed, right? And in fact, in the end, the development kind of failed. But so, yeah, we're going to come to why, like, trying to benefit a private company can be a public use or not. But, like, first, the problem with the holdout theory here is that, like, it seems plausible that some of these people are not holdouts, right? And so, you know, it's not just people who are trying to take advantage of, you know, the fact that they have a veto over the project. They might be the highest value users of this property. Before we turn to the private company piece, though, in the last few classes, we've talked about the amounts of deference that courts pay to homeowners associations where you can't attack how a rule applies to your particular home. You can only attack how it applies to the community as a whole. Zoning, you can attack how it applies to your particular parcel. This is more like a homeowners association where the court will consider the project as a whole and ask whether the project as a whole is for public use and whether the project as a whole is, you know, a government taking, not like, does this project need my particular parcel or not? What do we think about that? Is that reasonable, or should courts be willing to say, you know, no, like, this particular parcel you don't need, you can leave this house alone? Mr. Rudolph.
I think there's good arguments on both sides. It would be hard to make a rule for individual circumstances here. That people seem to be pretty tied to the homes. It was a family that was spread out among multiple properties. You don't really want the government kicking families out of homes, but at the same time, states should have some flexibility to decide how they want to develop their state economically. So, I mean, I can see both sides here.
Yeah, there's a risk of like micromanagement and just tying up litigation for years. But on the other hand, it is a big infringement of personal liberty, right? And your property rights when they're taking away your property. And so it seems like they should be able to justify it for each parcel. Mr. Buchanan?
Yeah, sort of on that personal liberty type of standpoint. If you take away certain people's property but let others keep their property based on this entire taking, and that's a really tough situation, and I'm sure there would be a lot of pushback from those people that have their property taken away.
Oh, there's a tremendous risk of like corruption and, you know, favoritism here, right? Like one of the funny things in the facts here is that this redevelopment plan wants to knock down a bunch of houses, but it leaves this bar that is like frequented by all of the political types in the town standing. Like it sort of carves the taking around that particular parcel of land, right? The homeowners don't have the political connection, and so they can't really stop it as much. So yeah, there's good arguments on both sides. But in general, courts have said, no, we're not going to micromanage this, right? We're going to defer to the developers who know like what the development actually needs, because we're not, you know, really capable of telling them, actually, you can carve out this one little parcel of land. But okay, so on the question of what counts as a public use, the court goes through a bunch of possible tests. So it sort of starts with this public access test, which would say like a public use is something that is open to the public. Do we think that would solve these concerns about like corruption and favoritism? Like, would that be a good test? Like if it's open to the public, then it's a public use? Mr. Rudolph, I don't know if you have your hand up from before or if it's...
No, sorry.
Mr. Saya.
I would say not necessarily. For example, if the city takes this land or the whole land and builds a public library, I don't know, 50 miles down the road, that no one will essentially use that. So that's not a justification for public use. This is something that people in practice will actually use that. And it would be beneficial for the welfare of the people in the community. So
if they build a public library on this land?
What's that?
If they build a public library on this land?
No, and yeah, for example, so if yeah, or a kindergarten in the community that most of the people are above 78 years of age, so that wouldn't essentially impact the general welfare of the community. So that's pointless.
Ms. Dowd?
I feel like even you could legislate around it, like we make 1/400th of it a public use and then use the rest of it for corrupt or for the public use, even for...
Yeah, so there's still potential for sort of gaming that, right? I mean, and you wouldn't even have to do like the 1/400th approach. Like what about something like a big hotel? Like a big hotel is publicly accessible, right? But it's probably run by a private company. And so you could still like do favors for your, you know, your cronies by giving them the hotel rights, you know, for free. So we might still get like sweetheart deals, even with things that are accessible to the public. But still, it means you're not going to get like condemning land to like hand to GM for use as a factory, because that's not going to be open to the public. So it might eliminate some of our corruption. What about like the Thomas test that says takings are only appropriate if the government retains ownership of the land? Mr. Carney?
Could you get around that with the straw man argument where the government takes it and then gives it to the private company right after?
Well, I mean, that's always kind of what they're doing if they're doing private development, but like they would say that that's unconstitutional, I guess, under the takings clause. Ms. Amberden?
I guess that would be kind of restrictive for what, like for developing the land for its most productive use. Like if you're restricting who it can be given to and saying that the government has to retain it, you're kind of like in the UPL thing with the land in Hawaii, it enabled like a few owners to hold all of the fee simple on the island.
Yeah, although that Hawaii case is a real outlier, right? But still, it definitely restricts things, right? Like government could get around it by leasing to private companies, right? Well, maybe we could say that like leases count as it's no longer a public use. I guess one question though is like, a lot of the time government has choices between, do we want to run this service ourselves or do we want to outsource it, right? So there are lots of things that have been either government run or privately run over the years. So like there are privately run schools or privately run prisons. There's like some cities that have outsourced their garbage collection to private industry. You know, lots of those things are fairly common. You know, private toll roads, right? And in theory, the government has done those things because they think it's a good idea, right? It's more efficient or it's more, you know, quick moving or cost effective or something, right? Like if the government can run the fire department or it can outsource it to, you know, Bob's for-profit fire department co. Presumably there's a reason they're outsourcing it. And this says, no, you can't do that. Or at least if you do that, you give up this valuable tool. Even if the public benefit is the same, right? Like the public may be getting the same benefit from private garbage collection as from public garbage collection. They may even not be paying for it. It may just be like the city is paying the company on behalf of the taxpayers, right? Like if you're a company, anytime you're doing a new thing, you sort of have this choice of, do we do this in-house or do we outsource it? And usually companies try to do the stuff in-house that they're good at, and they try to outsource the stuff that's not like their core competencies, right? Like, you know, if you're a restaurant, you're not really in the business of like manufacturing plastic takeout containers, so you buy those, right? Same thing here, like a city might conclude reasonably that like, you know, we're not experts in garbage collection, we should like hire a garbage collection company. Well, now they can't do that if they need to take land in order to do so. What about sort of the Justice O'Connor approach of, yes, you can take land to clear slums, but you can't take land to tear down homes that are not blighted. And Kilo's and Derry's homes are not blighted. Everyone seems to agree. Is that a good approach? Is that a better public use? Mr. Watts?
I mean, I think one issue is determining what a slum is, basically. Like,
sure, it's not at all a bright line.
Yeah, and I mean, it can be used in an oppressive manner, and it probably will be used in some sort of prejudiced manner at some point if you apply that standard.
It is a little weird that the pro-liberty dissents in this case are basically advocating for rules that would say you can use takings on poor people, but not on middle-class people, right? One advantage of this court's outcome is it sort of forces cities, or at least permits cities, to be a little more equal opportunity in their eminent domain. Ms. Mattel.
Yeah, excuse me. I was just going to say, Justice O'Connor's approach kind of just says like, well, it sucks if you're poor. If you're rich, you can't get your land condemned. But if you're poor and your house looks like a slum, then sorry, but it can be. So I just think that's a huge imbalance to be able to, I don't know, assert.
Yeah. Have you guys heard of Cards Against Humanity? I see a lot of nods. I guess most have. It's this card game, if you haven't. It's sort of like apples to apples, if you know that game, except it's like the tagline is like the party game for horrible people or something like that. So a few years ago, they did this sort of holiday thing where they sent like people who subscribed to it like different gifts over the holidays. And one of them was they bought a Picasso, and then they told the people who had bought the holiday promo, we're going to let you vote. We're either going to donate this Picasso to the Art Institute of Chicago, or we're going to cut it up into a bunch of little pieces and send them out to everyone. Let's say when that happened, the government had jumped in and said, no, that's bad. We don't want to destroy a Picasso. So we're just going to take it and we're going to pay compensation. It's a condemnation, and we're going to give it to the museum. Does that seem like a valid public purpose? Mr. Greenwald?
I would say so. It's preserving art that's been, available to the public. I mean, if it's been available to the public, especially if it's a public museum, not just a private one.
I mean, yeah, even setting aside the like threat to cut it into a bunch of little squares, right? Like giving the piece of art to the museum seems like, if nothing else, that's a public purpose, right? Like it's certainly a public purpose to put it on display. Ms. Mattel?
I definitely don't condemn destroying a Picasso, but
wait, you don't condemn it, or you don't condone
or
it?
sorry, opposite. I condemn it personally, but then I just thought about like our first class where we talked about property owners have the right to destroy. And
by the way, it was kind of a crappy lesser Picasso, if that makes you feel better.
That doesn't make me feel better. But I just like looked at my notes and it said very briefly, like you can't destroy animals as property and you can't destroy historic homes. But I'm wondering if, because it's a historical piece of artwork, like that would include. But if not, then I guess they have the right to destroy their property. Not that I support it, but
well, not if the government takes it first.
Oh, well, true, yeah.
Mr.
I
Watts?
guess that supersedes it.
Well, it's a little different too, because like taking artwork and taking someone's primary residence is kind of a big difference, especially if it's like artwork someone's planning to destroy, right? So it seems you could justify it more on the grounds that like nobody's losing their home over this, right? It's a company losing a painting, and that distinction seems meaningful, I think.
Yeah, I mean, because like my next question was going to be like, what's the difference between taking away the Picasso and taking an asset from someone who is not making the highest value use of it, right? Like if your property that has your home on it would be worth more to the community as a whole as part of a Pfizer facility, like, aren't you kind of wasting it just as much as the person who is cutting up the Picasso? And I guess your answer would be no, there's something more useful fundamentally about a home, right?
Not necessarily more useful to everybody, but to that individual, that utility is, potentially higher than a hypothetical Pfizer plant that never actualizes, basically. But
yeah, Ms. Lee?
The Savada and Endo case, we learned honored family autonomy. How is the precedent that the court relied here in McKeith not contradictory to that? Why couldn't the court honor family autonomy here?
Oh, it absolutely is contradictory. It's saying, yeah, we don't care that this is your home where your family grew up. We're going to take it away from you. It's possible that there's, sufficiently compelling arguments on the other side, but I mean, there's a reason there were angry dissents, right? I mean, one problem of, the government taking away your home or the government taking away your Picasso is maybe we don't think that the government is going to be well positioned to identify a higher value use. Like it's possible that this was a crappy Picasso. It's possible cutting it into a bunch of little squares was the highest value use of it, right? Because it sort of creates its own new artwork, performance art out of it. similarly, it's possible that, you know, the government is undervaluing the interests of the people who live in the home. Just looking through my questions to see what is most worth getting into in the last few minutes we have. The subscribers voted to give the painting to, or it wasn't a painting, it was like a print, I think, or a sketch or something. They gave it to the museum. I think I voted to cut it into squares, but that's because I'm a, you know, chaos Muppet. I mean, so we could evaluate this decision as doctrine, as politics, as policy. I mean, as a matter of doctrine, this is really unpersuasive, right? Because, like, as we mentioned, the Hawaiian case says the government can take property from landlords to give it to, you know, break up concentrated land ownership. This seems like certainly justifiable on similar grounds, right? Or not on similar grounds, but on terms of like increasing the tax base grounds, right? Berman versus Parker said before this that you can take property to complete an economic redevelopment of blighted property. And it's not clear what the difference between blighted and non-blighted property is. The politics provoked an enormous backlash, right? And I guess, like, you know, in PA Northwestern, I thought that the sort of like the court saying like first they come for the adult bookstores and eventually they came for me as a homeowner thing was a little silly, but like now after this opinion, it seems a little reasonable, right? Where government really can just take your house and give it to a private company if it wants. Does that mean that the dissents are right and that the majority opinion basically means no property is secure anymore? Mr. Andrews?
I mean, I guess this is hindsight, but the fact that they reached out to people and purchased the land with consent prior to invoking eminent domain would suggest that there is still some recognition of property rights by the government.
Mm-hmm. I mean, certainly government's not saying like we're, you know, ignoring all property rights, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Spinola?
Well, I think the dissents are basically saying that the government has gone too far because the threshold is so low that as long as the city or the state is making some kind of money, then they can just do whatever they want. And I was thinking about the natural gas case, the one where she had, what if Pfizer is storing like ingredients for the vaccine under someone's house and they're like, well, we're gonna take your house because we gotta you know, give our shots out to people. And I think zoning and this is like a cult. I personally don't get it. I don't like it. I don't see the purpose to it.
I mean, you're not alone, right? Like, this is a tremendously controversial opinion at the time. And, you know, the argument against it is basically no one's safe in their home anymore. Ms. Dowd?
You could also make an argument that the political process will fix this, right? So if legislators let this happen or approve projects or say, yeah, we're going to let the Keystone Pipeline come through here or whatever, that they will be promptly voted out and that these type of projects won't be stood for by the constituency.
And that's kind of what happened. Like, this was so controversial that basically every state passed a legislative restriction on eminent domain after this, right? And so that sort of plays into, you know, the argument that, like, sure, they can come after the homes, but they're taking an enormous political risk if they do so. You know, every state legislature thought that they were taking on too much risk and sort of made this impossible. I mean, Mr. Watts says it didn't fix it for Suzette Kilo. That's true. That is a problem, right? But it probably did something for the next one. You know, it is not the case that we have tons of eminent domain things out there taking a bunch of individual houses, right? It's actually pretty rare. Okay, I want to offer one last potential viewpoint to thinking about this case. So there is the argument that this takes away land in a way that infringes on individual liberty and individual property rights. And then there's kind of the welfarist defense of like, it's putting property toward the highest value use. A meta way to think about this case is maybe it's about who should decide. So the dissent is saying the courts should decide. The majority is saying, no, the political process should decide. And so one way to view this case is fundamentally as kind of a non-activist decision where the court is saying, we're going to keep constitutional law out of this. We're going to let the local governmental decision-making process make land use policy. Sort of the opposite of Mount Laurel, right? In a way that maybe this is promoting local control and community autonomy instead of the courts getting involved. Like this may be a good example of home rule, right? Now, the counter argument would be that under the dissent's approach, you still have to have all of those things before you have any taking, but also it has to get through the courts. And so maybe it's more of a protection for local control. But it's a good way to, it's an interesting way to think about the case, right? Maybe this is not a total infringement on liberty. Maybe this is just a preservation of local control. I do want to say a couple of words really quickly about regulatory takings in our last minute or two. So like I said at the beginning, a lot of takings cases are like Kilo, where the government just wants to take title to your property. But then there are questions about, is some regulation a taking at all? So we can think of lots of examples, right? Like the government bans a synthetic drug that was previously legal, and someone has a bunch of it, it's now contraband, it's now illegal, and so the government has made its value zero. Have they taken it? Or if the government says like, you know, you are an agricultural producer of raisins, you have to set aside a certain percentage of them for safety testing. Is that a taking? Or, you know, you are not allowed to build on this piece of real estate you own because of, you know, a historical district or environmental reasons or something. Is that a taking? And so this is the problem of regulatory takings. We could spend weeks on this. It's fascinating. We are out of time. But I just want to note one example, which is there is a zoning rule in New York City that buildings that are within a certain area, like a couple blocks, have to average no more than a certain height. And one option we might expect from that is all of the buildings get built up to that height. But another option is that the property owners can trade their rights. Like you can sell some of your height rights to a neighbor. And that might be more efficient overall, because then you get some taller buildings, some shorter buildings, and that's can provide benefits like more light and more views and stuff like that. And so that's in practice what we have seen happen. So if you see the photo I'm sharing, this is of, you know, aerial view from above Central Park. The really tall building top left there is 432 Park Avenue. It was recently finished. I posted a really interesting story on the website a couple weeks ago about this building where like all the billionaires who own condos in it now are pissed that their, you know, elevators are making noise and things like that. It was at the time that it was built the second tallest building in New York City, the tallest residential building in the world. Basically, the developer bought this tiny little square of land and then bought air rights from all the nearby property owners. And because it's kind of tiny, it can be really tall with the average still being fairly low. And they also built, if you look closely, you might be able to see every fourth floor it's sort of empty, and there's like air that can go through it. They built these really tall mechanical floors, and under the New York rules, those don't count toward the height. So they made them taller than necessary just to make the building really tall. So that sparked a bunch of controversy, and the mayor said they were going to close that loophole. But before they did, it became a thing. And so now there's a bunch of tall, super tall residential buildings in progress on basically Park Avenue South and Billionaires Row, as they call it sometime. This is a view from one of them. And then same story in Chicago, where these couple of buildings in New York got in right under the wire and right before the city has closed this loophole. Same thing with Trump Towers Chicago. Most buildings in Chicago don't have any kind of big name or sign or anything on the building. When this one was built, the company put a giant Trump sign on it, and then the city was like, that's ugly, we're going to ban signs on cities or on buildings for aesthetic reasons. Aesthetic zoning for the win, except that now the only building with a sign on it is that one. And that made the Trump Tower people perfectly happy because they're grandfathered in. They can't really be forced to take it down, or at least before an amortization period. And so these are some nice cases to end the course on, because they highlight some of these core questions about why we recognize property and what are the effects of different mechanisms for regulating it. So if we think back to the beginning of the course, we spent a lot of time talking about different reasons the law recognizes private property and different ways to evaluate legal rules. Sometimes we think utilitarian or welfarist, where our goal is to increase welfare or utility. If that's right, takings can be good or bad, because the government might be using it for a higher value use where the taking overcomes some legit obstacles to a negotiated agreement, like the highway example, probably a good thing. But if the government is just being corrupt, then maybe it's a bad thing. And so our key question is going to be, who's best equipped to make that judgment? What judgment's going to produce the best results? Sometimes we think property law should reward the first to do something, or to possess property or occupy it or something, or people who mix their labor with the land. That's going to encourage labor and productive use. And if that's right, takings are a problem, because by definition, the government will never be the first user. And sometimes we think that property should reflect personhood and the full development of the individual and individual autonomy, or maybe individual liberty, something like that. And if that's right, takings are a disaster because they don't respect the ties people have developed to their property. So like Suzette Kelo spent years in her home, developed a lot of ties to it. If we take it away from her, we are discounting or eliminating the value of those personhood ties. And regulatory takings might be especially problematic because it means the government can kind of redefine your property rights as it sees fit through these indirect mechanisms that are framed as neutral regulations, but have very significant effects. So then to some extent, how we feel about takings is a function of how we feel about these underlying purposes of property. If our goal is to maximize wealth, taking might be a good thing. If our goal is to respect liberty, much less so. That's all I got. I apologize for going over by 6 minutes. I've had a wonderful semester. I know it's been a hard one for a lot of folks, myself included. I hope that, next year will be different and I'll see all of you in person. But have a wonderful summer and see you soon. Thanks, everyone.